Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Patrick Heller with the Natural Resource Governance Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this first webinar in the new series co-hosted by NRGI and the International Institute for Sustainable Development on national oil companies and climate change. We're really excited about this series, which will be rolling out over the course of the next several months. We think that there's a good opportunity that these discussions can help fill some gaps that currently exist in the discourse around climate change and sustainable development. And so we're really grateful to all of you for being here with us today. So we think this series can really help fill some gaps. You know, as many of you on the call know, national oil companies play a really central role in global oil and gas markets. They produce more than half of the world's oil and gas. They control a strong majority of global reserves, and they're responsible for about half or a little bit less than half of all spending in the sector. But in spite of this really important role that they play, international discourse and dialogues around climate change often doesn't pay as much attention to the strategies, roles, challenges of national oil companies as one might think in light of their importance. And within oil and gas producing countries, we're only just now starting to hear a little bit of the evolving dialogue around what climate change means for NOCs plans and how energy transition might impact their business and their economic fortunes. You know, in NRGI, our focus as an organization is on development and good governance in oil, gas, and mineral producing countries. And it started to become more and more clear over the last couple of years that there's a real need for concerted public discussion and decision-making about what climate change and the global transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy means for the development prospects of these countries, how they can build sustainable and diverse economies that are less dependent over the long term on oil and gas. And NOCs play a huge role in that. And so the questions around what NOCs will be doing and how they'll be managing their portfolios are really central. On the IISD side, IISD and its partners have been deeply involved in efforts to quantify and to try and narrow the production gap. That's the gap between the amount of fossil fuel production that's consistent with global climate goals and the plans that governments and oil companies actually have for continuing to invest in the sector. But in spite of the way in which these issues are deeply intertwined, we found that we're not talking to each other enough. Climate advocates and natural resource governance advocates, governments, NOCs, and NGOs. Even within governments, we find that oftentimes the NOC isn't talking as much as you would expect to the Environment Ministry or the climate agencies about long-term plans and how they connect. And that's why we're excited to embark upon this series to try and connect the dots, so to speak. So over the next 3 months, we'll have these discussions. Throughout these conversations, we're going to be aiming for a diverse set of perspectives and views. So we'll have officials from national oil companies, government officials, activists, researchers, climate specialists. And we know that we probably won't always agree on the priorities or the questions to ask, or certainly the solutions, but we're really excited to have the opportunity to start to raise some of these questions and to start narrowing those gaps that exist in this discourse. So this is the first session in the series. I'm going to take a moment to give you a little bit of a sense of where the series is going, just so you know what you're in store for. So you're in the first session today, and I'm going to talk about the first session specifically in a moment, but generally speaking, today's session is about challenges to NOC core business models and how some companies are starting to respond. We'll come back to that in a moment. Then during the second half of May, with the date to be finalized, but we'll be in touch with all of you, we'll look in depth at national oil companies' potential roles in providing renewable energy and, more broadly speaking, in investing in economic diversification. There's a lot of interest among NOCs and their governments in these new kinds of roles for these companies, but also a lot of questions and a lot of challenges. And we want to use the session to explore, probe the pros and cons, and talk about the potential. And then finally, in June, we'll focus on climate advocacy and the politics of NOCs, how climate advocates and NOCs can talk to each other better, and how they can take into account, in particular, the political imperatives that NOCs are facing, and what that might mean for how NOCs engage in their home economies and in the global discourse. So that's a little bit where we're heading. One note that I want to make about the series is these 3 public sessions will be accompanied by a smaller discussion group of experts from a diverse range of perspectives who will be getting together after each of the public sessions to try and draw together key conclusions and questions for further research. We'll try to compile all of that into a brief that NRGI and IISD will produce in advance of COP26 later this year to try and come out with some core questions and core findings on the impact of NOCs on climate change and the impact of energy transition on NOCs. So that's the plan for the series. Now I'm excited to jump into today's session. Today we'll be looking in particular about how NOCs can, should, and are starting to examine what energy transition means for their core business, right? For company investments in the oil and gas sector itself. Many of you will have seen earlier this year, NRGI came out with a report called Risky Bet. And what that report sought to do was to measure the exposure of the portfolios of national oil companies worldwide to an energy transition that might result in dramatic changes over the long term to oil and gas demand. And what we found is that globally, national oil companies are planning to invest up to $2 trillion in the upstream over the long term, of which more than $400 billion wouldn't break even if the world met the Paris climate goals and oil and gas demand were impacted accordingly. So that's a huge question for a number of NOCs and for their home economies, how to assess the risks that exist in their portfolio and how to adapt and evolve strategy in order to avoid avoidable risks and to manage those risks most effectively. It's also a huge question, obviously, for the global movement to limit climate change. As national oil companies and their governments are putting public resources into new production and new oil and gas activity, that has a big impact on goals of winding down over the long term. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. And we've seen that, like some international oil companies, some national oil companies are beginning to think in a very serious way about how to adapt their portfolios to account for this risk. But it's early days. And what we want to do is to start to share some experiences, but also to share some of the tough questions and challenges that companies are facing. And in particular, that the governments and citizens of oil producing countries should be considering as they interact with, manage, and supervise their national companies. So you'll stop having to hear from me in a moment. I couldn't be more excited with the group of panelists that we have here to start to illuminate some of these issues today. I'll give everyone a fuller introduction as we dive in, but just to give you a little bit of a sense of who you've got with you and where we're going. Our panelists are Greg Muttit, Senior Policy Advisor at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Juan Manuel Rojas Payan, who's Senior Vice President for Strategy and New Ventures at Ecopetrol, the Colombian national oil company, Peter Mulisa, who's Chief Corporate and Legal Affairs Officer at UNOC, the Ugandan national oil company, and Valerie Marceau, Associate Fellow in the Energy, Environment, and Resources Program at Chatham House. Just a couple of ground rules before we get into the meat of the discussion. I always like, when I'm an attendee in a session like this, I always find myself wondering, who else is in the room? How many people are here? Who's talking? Just to let you know, for those of you who can't see, right now we have 92 attendees, so there's 92 of you watching this session. And I know from the registrations that is people from all over the world. And so we're really grateful for that discussion. For those of you who are so inclined, I always find that it's nice if you introduce yourselves using the chat function. So if you are so inclined, just drop a note so your fellow attendees can see you, who you are, what country you're from, what organization or company you represent. If you do so, just a Zoom housekeeping note, make sure you copy the chat to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see who you are. One other note is that we'll be kicking this off with a question that I will pose to each panelist to kind of launch them into sharing some reflections. These are questions that we've been discussing in advance of the session. Each panelist will have about 7 or 8 minutes to present. And even though I talk for too long myself, I have no problem with hypocrisy. And so I will give the panelists a 1-minute warning when their time is almost up. But as each of the panelists is speaking, don't be shy about starting to post questions in the Q&A. And at the end of the session, I'll do my best to curate things as best we can so that we can answer as many of your questions as possible. So with that, let's jump in. And Greg, I'll turn to you first. A little bit of an introduction of Greg, and I'll do this with each of the panelists. So Greg's a senior policy advisor at IISD, and you'll get to know him, those of you who don't already know him, well over the course of the series, because he's my co-organizer for the entire NOCs and climate change series. Greg's work at IISD focuses on the role of energy supply in global climate efforts. And he comes to our discussion today with more than 20 years experience researching fossil fuels and climate change, with a particular focus on the political economy of energy transition. And Greg's the author of a book, Fuel on the Fire, Oil and Politics in Occupied Iraq. So Greg, to kick it off to you, I think you can really help us begin to sort of put some of these pieces together. Your work focuses on how fossil fuel production needs to change as the world seeks to pursue its global climate goals, and to keep us within the carbon budget and with transition limits. How do you interpret the implications of the Paris goals for global oil production more broadly, and what questions does it raise for NOCs more specifically? Thanks, Greg. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And thank you everyone for joining today. It's great to have so many of you. To answer that question, I'm going to, in a moment, share a couple of slides to illustrate the pace of change that the Paris goals imply for oil. And then after the slides, I'm going to suggest some questions that arise from that for NOCs specifically. And I think the starting point here is that now in the 2020s, climate mitigation is not about making incremental reductions in emissions compared to some business as usual baseline. The issue now is one of rapid and fundamental change in energy systems. The carbon budget for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and that means the total amount of carbon dioxide that can be emitted over the long term, is now equivalent to just 11 years of current emissions. Now, I'm going to share my screen. And this first slide shows the carbon budget, how it relates to fossil fuels based on some research I'm currently involved in. And on the right-hand side, those orange bars, you see the carbon budgets for 1.5 degrees and for 2 degrees to reflect the Paris goals. Those are taken from IPCC reports. On the left, what you see is the carbon dioxide emissions that will be emitted from burning the oil, gas, and coal that are in fields and mines that are already producing. So that extracted over the lifetime of those existing developed fields and mines, the full amount of oil, gas, and coal reserves within them. Now, if we included non-fossil fuel emissions from industrial processes and land use change, that column on the left would be bigger. What you see is that this column, so the already existing fields and mines, will give us more carbon dioxide than we can afford to emit while keeping warming to 1.5 degrees and almost as much as 2 degrees. And so this implies that to achieve the Paris goal, certainly to achieve the 1.5 degree goal, some of the existing fields and mines will have to be closed early, potentially losing money on the investments that have been made in them. And any new fields or mines that are developed on top of this amount will either contribute to missing the Paris goals by a larger amount and causing greater climate disruption, or conversely, will increase the amount of investment that is risked by policies to mitigate climate change. Now, that's the situation. However, unfortunately, governments and companies are still developing new fields and mines. Now, in this first slide, we've looked at reserves. My second slide, which I'm trying, here we go. This looks at production over time, and this is taken from the production gap report, which Patrick mentioned in the introduction. The production gap report is published annually by 5 organizations, including my organization, IISD, including the UN Environment Programme, and led by the Stockholm Environment Institute. And what this graph shows you, the red line at the top adds up government plans and projections for oil production worldwide, leading to a continued global increase. The brown line underneath it shows the oil demand that would be implied by countries meeting their original pledges they made in Paris in 2015. And this is before building in this year's revisions by governments to their pledges to make them more ambitious. And then the lower lines, the green and blue lines, show what level of oil demand would be consistent with achieving the Paris goals of keeping well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts for 1.5. And those are taken from IPCC scenarios. Now, what you can see here is that there is a gap between the trajectory we're on, the red line reflecting government's plans and projections, and the trajectory that would achieve the Paris goals, which means aiming for the blue line at the bottom and staying well below the green line. Now, again, there's a danger that these plans for production growth contribute to a failure to meet the Paris goals, or alternatively, if governments are successful in meeting the goals, the investments that have been made as we continue along that red line will be at risk. And the later we continue on the red line before changing course, the more rapid the change will have to be. And so the greater the risk to investments. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just finish by suggesting some questions that I think arise from this global picture, specifically for NOCs, and I hope these can help inform our discussion. I think with this problem, there are 2 ways of looking at it. First, as a climate mitigation problem, or second, as a business and economic risk problem. As a climate mitigation problem, the question for us, I think, is what can national oil companies do to adjust their production plans to contribute to achieving the Paris goals, which their governments have committed to? As an economic risk problem, there's a question about how might oil markets change over time? How will those changes affect NOCs? And how can NOCs prepare for the various possible outcomes? For example, at some point, global oil demand will peak and start to decline. Some people believe it has already peaked. Many people believe the peak will occur during this decade. And we don't know how oil markets will behave when annual volumes are in long-term decline, because we haven't experienced that during more than 150 years of almost entirely consistent growth in global oil demand. And the issue here isn't about predicting what will happen. I think it's more about being prepared for what are the possible futures from a business risk point of view. The dynamic I would expect is that worsening climate impacts over the years to come will drive progressively more ambitious climate policy. And that policy in turn will drive technological changes, for instance, in transportation technologies. Now, a result of this particular dynamic is that I think when it happens, energy systems will change quite fast and probably quite unpredictably compared to the smoother pathways we see in the models. As for the international oil companies, the investor-owned companies, I would say they are at the very beginnings of a consideration that about what happens in the medium term, where the future is not about continued growth in global oil demand. Few of the international oil companies have fully developed plans for this, but the questions are very live, for example, among their shareholders, about whether companies should transform themselves into non-oil companies, whether they should manage the process of decline, and what risks they face if they continue to plan for growth. For national oil companies, I think this debate is more nascent, so I'm very excited that we're talking about it today, but it's no less important. I see this as presenting the biggest questions for the future of oil since the changes in national ownership of resources that took place in the mid-20th century, and which are really the historical roots of today's NOCs. NOCs have some advantages over IOCs, over international oil companies. NOCs exist for a public purpose. They have a capacity to plan for the long term. They have the resources of governments to help manage a transition. The starting point, in my view, which I'm looking forward to discussing today, is the question, what is the role for NOCs in a world of declining oil? Thank you ever so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Greg. That's a great introduction to a very important range of questions. Let's turn to the perspective of one NOC now. Juan Manuel, if you could turn on your camera. Hi. So Juan Manuel Rojas is Senior Vice President for Strategy and New Ventures at Ecopetrol. I imagine most of you are familiar with Ecopetrol, but for those who aren't, it's the Colombian state-owned oil company, but which also trades some shares on the Colombia and New York stock exchanges. And Ecopetrol has been thinking quite a lot about some of these issues as the company charts its future. Recent research by Bloomberg placed Ecopetrol in the top 10 in Bloomberg's new climate transition scores, not just among state-owned oil companies, but among all oil and gas companies worldwide, reflecting the degree to which the company is beginning to think about the carbon intensity of its production and how to adapt its business models. But nonetheless, Ecopetrol faces significant challenges, with some of its fields facing relatively high break-even prices that might be vulnerable to a sustained decline in oil production, and questions from environmental activists about the company's investment in unconventional oil and gas deposits. I can't imagine someone better to help us talk through the company's evolving strategy than Juan Manuel. He's responsible for business development in the upstream and for the company's overall long-term strategy. And he joins our discussion today with more than 20 years experience in the energy industry in the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. So Juan Manuel, as we were preparing the session, one of the things that really struck me was a recent article in the Financial Times that highlighted Ecopetrol's approach, challenges, and strategy for weighing some of these issues that we're talking about, how to diversify the company's business model, how to adapt, how to increase Ecopetrol's resilience in the face of this global energy transition. And what we'd like to hear from you is essentially, what are the core features of your strategy to deliver returns to Colombian shareholders, but at the same time guarding against some of the downside risks that the industry faces? So really looking forward to your thoughts, Juan Manuel. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Patrick, and good morning to everyone. And thanks for the opportunity to share our thoughts and ideas. Thanks to the Natural Resource Governance Institute and the IISD for this opportunity. Energy transition, it definitely poses a tremendous challenge for oil companies and for national oil companies. And let me drive through the way in which Ecopetrol is undertaking this challenge. I will start by saying that Colombia has announced efforts to increase its decarbonization aspect. And the current situation of our country, in Colombia, is a country that emits on an annual basis 291 million tons of CO2 per year in greenhouse gases, 34% of which are represented by energy and industry. Colombia's main sources of emissions derive from deforestation and other land use changes. So a joint effort between the government and companies in that front is crucial. It's not only the effort that oil and gas companies and energy and industry companies have to undertake, but also efforts have to be undertaken in the agricultural aspect and in deforestation aspect. Having said that, we are conscious and aware of the transition that we must undertake if we want to contribute to the reduction efforts that the country has to carry out. And in that sense, Ecopetrol has defined 4 pillars in its roadmap to energy transition. The first one, it's increasing competitiveness of our traditional oil and gas business to what? To avoid stranded assets and to reduce emissions coming from those specific assets. That's the first pillar. We have undertaken a very thorough exercise to characterize a portfolio, identify of those 244 fields of oil and gas, which are in risk to become stranded, which are those that are already stranded, and what efforts we must carry out within that portfolio to reduce the emissions of those assets. That's a first pillar. The second pillar is related to diversification of a business without losing focus on oil and gas, of course, because that's a traditional conventional business. But our diversification efforts have been undertaken to identify opportunities. And we've already started a thorough work in terms of electricity, mainly with low emission electricity. The second, hydrogen possibilities, carbon capture, use and storage, nature-based solutions, and water. Those are the areas that Ecopetrol has been exploring in terms of diversification. I will go in depth further ahead in the presentation on those. The third area is associated on how we are accelerating our decarbonization, and we have established some targets within the Ecopetrol group for 2030 and for 2050 in terms of our emissions targets, and I will go in detail in those in a couple of minutes. And our last pillar where Ecopetrol has been focusing its efforts, it's associated to TEESG, what we call technology, environmental, social, and governance. We do believe that technology can leverage the efforts of the company in advancing our environmental, social, and governance policies within the corporation. So let me go into detail, particularly in the last 3 aspects. We have announced recently, and the piece in the Financial Times that Patrick mentioned makes reference to our bid for Interconexión Eléctrica S.A., the national transmission company, which is much more a multi-Latina, what we call a corporation that manages 55 kilometers of transmission grid in LATAM and Central America. And we feel that this non-binding offer that we made to acquire ISA, or the government's of Colombia participation in ISA, is our first step in our advance towards a sustainable future. We do believe that with the acquisition of ISA, if we're able to close that business, Ecopetrol will be able to reduce its emissions per EBITDA, and that's a first major step. We believe it's transformational for the company. If you take a look to what other oil and gas companies have made, they have engaged in renewables, it's true, but none of them have made a material acquisition of a business that represents 15%, 15% of their EBITDA. And so that we do believe makes this transaction and the announcement of Ecopetrol different to what other peers in the industry are doing. We also believe it's critical for energy transition, because if solar farms and wind farms are to be connected and the energy produced by those will be dispatched, they require a better grid. And so we do foresee in the future big investments reinforcing energy transmission grids and improving the capacity of those grids to undertake renewable energy. That's why we thought this would be transformational. The second effort of Ecopetrol, moving in terms of diversification, is associated to what we call nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions. And in that sense, we do believe Colombia has an enormous potential. Deforestation in 2019, for example, in Colombia amounted to more than 150,000 hectares, mainly concentrated in the Amazon, Catatumbo, and Orinoco regions of the country. 55% of greenhouse gas emissions correspond to the deforestation and other land uses in the country. Globally, is 24%. So Ecopetrol, in terms of diversification, believes has a great opportunity to carry out projects in this area. And Colombia has advantages being in the Amazon region. And we will focus on projects that not only serve as natural carbon sinks, but that can generate a series of social and environmental benefits for the territories and communities where they are implemented in the country. We see this as a source of diversification ahead. In a post-COVID world, we want to encourage these investments as part of the economic recovery of the communities where we operate. And so we also see this complementing our current operations. This is another area where we focus in diversification, and we will start investing in this type of operations. That's in terms of diversification. Let me go through the other pillar, which is called, which is associated to decarbonization. And Ecopetrol is implementing a decarbonization plan that includes the permanent update and verification of the greenhouse gas emissions, the implementation of an emission reduction portfolio, the definition of the roadmap to achieve the net zero emissions goal, as you are seeing in the screen, and the design and execution of an offset portfolio of natural-based solutions. The implementation of this plan has already yielded positive results for the company. Ecopetrol achieved a cumulative reduction of 8.4 million tons of CO2 in the last 8 years. And the result of the last decade was achieved through programs in different areas. Let me just cite some of those. Mainly a reduction of fugitive emissions and venting, decreasing gas flaring, efforts to achieve energy efficiency in our operations in the refineries, and incorporated renewable energy projects focused mainly in solar farms. We have announced a program of 400 megawatts of renewable energy, and we are advancing already. We have finished the construction, and in operation, we have 22 megawatts, and before the end of the year, we will have another 50 megawatts being connected to the grid. By 2023, we want to have 400 megawatts installed of renewable power capacity. The portfolio shift and reduction of scope 1 and 2 emissions in Ecopetrol will reduce total emissions by 50% by 2050, as you are seeing in the screen. And by 2030, we have announced that the group seeks to reduce its CO2 emission by 25%, scope 1 and scope 2, compared to the 2019 baseline. So in terms of decarbonizing, we are also carrying a lot of efforts. Now, let me go into the last pillar of our energy transition strategy, which is associated to what I call TEEZ, and I will try to be to summarize because I know time is running out. Incorporating TEEZ at the top of the agenda of Ecopetrol requires a series of elements that need to be in place to promote real change. I would like to highlight the need to encourage formal and informal leadership within the corporation around these issues, develop a clear narrative towards the different stakeholders, and have necessary or mandatory governance structure and incentives that motivate the organization towards the common goal. We have maximized the value of technology in order to be able to implement much more our strategy in terms of environmental, social, and governance. And let me drive you through quickly of how technology is improving our efforts in EESG. During the past 4 years, we have implemented a lot of programs associated to the fourth industrial revolution, such as cloud, artificial intelligence, robotics, blockchain, IoT, analytics, elastic computing, and big data through different initiatives in Ecopetrol in the digital agenda. Today, we have more than 90 bots operating in the company for detection of gas flaring, for detection of emissions, for improving energy efficiency. And that is working very well in the company. We are using technology to communicate better with interest groups in the areas where we operate. And that has improved substantially how we relate to communities, understanding the needs and what they require in the territories where we are present. So this is a large part of this is a very important part of the strategy of those 4 pillars. And we are investing also substantially resources in improving our efforts in that area. I will stop there, Patrick. I have summarized those 4 pillars. I hope I'm ready to answer questions, and we really much appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Juan Manuel, for walking us through the company's approach. And I think that provides really rich food for thought, for discussion, and for other NOCs to observe and reflect upon as they chart their own course. We're going to turn now to Peter Mulisa. Peter, I just want to do a sound check and make sure you can hear me. Okay, Peter, are you there? I see you on my screen.
Yes, Patrick, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, great. You're coming through loud and clear, Peter. Thanks so much. So Peter is Chief Corporate and Legal Affairs Officer at the Uganda National Oil Company, one of the newest national oil companies in the world. And this is a really interesting moment for UNOC and for oil in Uganda. Just this month, the Ugandan government and UNOC announced that after years of negotiations, they had reached a final investment decision with Uganda's oil sector partners, Total, CNOOC, and other companies, which might mean that oil will begin to be produced in Uganda as early as 2025. Now, Uganda and UNOC are entering the oil business at a really challenging moment for the industry and for the planet. Big expectations about what oil will deliver to the country, but at the moment where the industry globally is potentially facing decline. And with a lot of questions that are being posed, especially by environmental activists, around the infrastructure that will need to be built in order to bring Uganda's oil to market. But on the flip side, the Ugandan government and Ugandan citizens see oil as a potential boon for the country's development and a source of much needed fiscal revenues that the state can invest in the advancement of the country's development goals. I know that Peter has been thinking quite a lot about these issues of how UNOC can be an effective steward for the management of the sector in the interest of the Ugandan people. And so I'm really excited to have him here with us today. Peter brings to this discussion more than a decade of experience, both inside the oil sector and outside, as a lawyer working on issues including tax administration, corporate governance, and project finance. So Peter, thanks so much for being here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you with this sort of framing question. So as I said, UNOC is entering the business at a very complex time for the industry. There's new momentum for investment in Uganda. There are also some big challenges and details to sort through, including on how to finance the country's share of oil-related infrastructure. So we're just interested in hearing from you how you and how UNOC see the company's role in the evolution of the country's strategy, and how you plan to deliver value to Uganda while limiting the exposure of your business and the broader economy to some of these downside risks. So Peter, over to you, and thanks again for being here today.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Good evening to everybody. And permit me not to turn on my camera. I took off a few days, Patrick. We had a long period of negotiations. Yeah. So I'm in a place with very limited bandwidth.
No problem. Thanks so much for being here.
Yes, so let me just pick from where you are. You stopped, and you did really summarize where we are at. We are at the development stage of our oil and gas resources that we hope to start producing in 2025 early. And we're looking at a production profile of close to 30 years. But at the same time, we are running exploration rounds. So we hope to find more resources to put online as well. And so it's challenging that while we're excited about the production, the possibility of supporting government revenue, we have this conversation around energy transition, peak demand that one of our panelists spoke about, and what the impact could be on our prices, or rather on our revenues, and the possibility of its impact on the ability of government to perform obligations that improve the lives of our people. And that being the case, it's a challenge and we have to think about it. Of course, right now, everybody's excited about the resources and how we are getting into production. But we have to think about these things, especially as an NOC in the long term, and to see how we maintain value for the country. But just to give you an outlay of how our projects are structured under UNOC, we have, so these upstream projects that are going to produce, we have a pipeline that is going to transport the crude from Uganda through Tanzania to the sea. And that pipeline has of course, comments around its financing, basically challenging it because of the assumption that it's going to increase our carbon footprint and have environmental issues. So we have that pipeline. It's one of the projects that is sanctioned. We have a refinery that is under process of front-end engineering and design. We hope to sanction the refinery early next year, and we'll have a petrochem industry around the refinery. And all these, in our view, will significantly improve the GDP and the ability of the government to meet socioeconomic or its socioeconomic obligations. And of course, now turning to climate change, decarbonization, and what we are thinking about. Of course, Patrick and all panelists and participants, you know, it's for sure that climate change is here. There are efforts to curb its impact. We have the Paris Agreement, but for economies like mine, like Uganda and Africa in general, or sub-Saharan Africa in general, we have challenges of ability to adapt to any changes that will occur caused by climate change. And that becomes a cause of concern and a reason for us as a national company to start thinking about responses, because we must be part of this agenda to limit climate change impacts, because they will hit our people probably more than the developed countries. So in terms of what we are doing on our end, Patrick, we have recognized the need as an NOC to have an agenda first on climate change, and first of all, looking at our business. For now, we are structured as a national oil company, purely dealing in the business of oil and gas. And so what we are looking at, first of all, is engaging our stakeholders, which we started late last year, to ensure that we are able to restructure our mandate and our business portfolio to also focus on energy production. And there is a real opportunity in Uganda because energy penetration is still low. It's below 30%. And so there is a real market for energy. And so we are looking at in the long term, in the long term, to become an energy company, but more especially focusing on energy provision for our people. And there are opportunities for that to be done. So to get that done, we are now at our management board level discussions, stakeholder management, to just have alignment on a change of mandate. And listening to Ecopetrol, I can note that they are hundreds of miles ahead of us, but well, we hope we will catch up. Now, in terms of our in-country, in terms of our produced resources, upstream, and as we continue to do exploration, we are looking at focusing more and creating real possibility of focusing on in-country use of the resources that we produce upstream. And so you will see probably in the next 3, 4, 5 years, our focus largely on the refinery and the petrochemicals businesses around them. So that our view is that at a certain point, if the world market moves moves so fast and the prices of crude so deep, then we can continue to produce the fields that will be producing and the resources that will be known, but mainly focusing on in-country use, support industrialization, support energy production, and all those areas. So that is one area that we're looking at. And as a company, we are integrated. So we are both in upstream, midstream, and downstream, and focusing on the petrochemical industries, and focusing on refining inland to support the needs in the country and our neighbors is one of the areas that we are looking at. And of course, at a governmental level, we are influencing and driving a view on changing policy, putting in place a policy that focuses on climate change and decarbonization. We've, at the level of Ministry of Energy, commenced that conversation, and we believe that as a national company, we'll continue to drive it until we see the government put in place a policy that focuses in this particular area. Now, in terms of decarbonization, I'll just pick a few things, and they are not really as big, but I'll pick a few things that we are looking at in terms of managing our emissions, which generally for as a country are still low. So to start with the policy and the legal framework as it is today, gas flaring is bad, is illegal in Uganda, it's prohibited. So that's one point that we, at the point of production in Uganda, the point of exploration, appraisal, through that whole stage, there is no flaring of any of our products. And so that helps us, I think, to limit on the footprint, that carbon footprint that would have arisen from flaring. So it's prohibited by law. And in terms of UNOC facing elements, on our pipeline, we have looked at the carbon footprint it will create. And so what we've done in terms of powering the pipeline, because it's a heated pipeline, we have put in place, we've actually adjusted the business model to have a solar plant, a solar farm put in place, a process we call solarization, to provide the power that will heat the pipeline. Initially, we were to burn to burn crude oil to heat the pipeline. But because of this discussion and engagement and realization that we need to be part of this agenda, we have adjusted that plan, and we're going to have a solarization process. So the pipeline will be heated by solar energy.
Peter, one minute left, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Just the final one. On the part of UNOC, our intention is to have all our midstream projects carbon neutral. So we intend, and we are focusing on planting about 20 million trees in the next 5 years to just make sure that the carbon emission from the refinery and from our other midstream projects, as much as possible, neutral. And so that target is on. We have engagements with the stakeholders and partners, and I'm sure you'll be seeing us engage in this. Last but not the least, in Uganda, most of our people rely on charcoal. So there's a lot of deforestation to burn trees and produce charcoal. And so what we're doing as UNOC, and it's a policy that is supported by the government, is to work on making LPG cheaper and avail it to households to ensure that this deforestation and burning of trees to produce charcoal is limited. So in essence, Patrick, I think that summarizes where we are at. It's initial stages, but we have this conversation and topic and agenda in focus. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. Really appreciate you joining to share that perspective. Difficult challenges, as you say, and very interesting to hear where UNOC hopes to be going. So now, last but not least, we'll turn it over to Valerie Marceau. Valerie is an associate fellow at Chatham House, and she is one of the world's leading experts on national oil companies. Her research and advisory work have focused on questions ranging from huge, big picture questions. What does an NOC strategy look like? What role do these companies play in their economies and the global marketplace? To very specific questions of operational strategy that companies and governments are facing. And in particular, one of the reasons that I'm so excited that Valerie can join today is that more than almost anybody, she has a sense of the whole scope of different kinds of NOCs that are out there in the world. Valerie is the author of Oil Titans, which is a book on the biggest Middle Eastern national oil companies and some of the challenges that they've faced in governance and management. But on the other hand, she leads the new producers group, which gathers officials from countries such as Uganda and others that are entering the oil and gas industry. And so really, really glad to have Valerie here with us. In particular, her work recently has been focusing more and more on what energy transition means for new producers, and more broadly speaking, what the role of oil producing countries is in the fight against climate change. So Valerie, I'm going to turn it over to you. Your work has focused heavily on the huge roles that NOCs play in the evolution of their home economies and political systems. And one of the things, as I say, that you've really drawn out in your work is the big variety in challenges and opportunities among different kinds of NOCs. As you think about these challenges, these opportunities, and the responsibility of different kinds of NOCs in the global system, how can we think about the challenges that energy transition will impose in different places and how it might impact what NOCs do within their society? Valerie, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And thanks for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here. And also it's really great to come as the last speaker because I can kind of pull and draw in some of the comments made before me. So as you say, Patrick, the NOCs are going to face significant challenges in the transition, but also they'll have opportunities. And Peter and Juan Manuel have outlined some of the specific commercial opportunities that they saw for their NOCs in that transition. But taking it a little more broadly, I wanted to just say a little bit about, how different NOCs are from IOCs, because unlike them, they have a broader mission, as Greg alluded, and they're judged against a wider range of performance metrics. And if I were to simplify it for the sake of argument, it would be that they're created to meet domestic energy demand, and even if that's at on a non-commercial basis. And second, to provide economic rent to government. So what's interesting is that as energy providers, is that aspect of their mandate, they can transform into national energy companies more readily than IOCs can. They can, go into renewables, power for domestic needs, etc. And they can refocus their portfolio, as we've just heard from the previous speakers, towards those low carbon fuels and investments to meet the domestic needs and the energy security of the country. But what's important is that involves reduced economic rent. So they're no longer rent makers, rent as in, the amount that's earned that's greatly in excess of the cost of production. So, what you could say cheekily is just easy money. Because renewables and clean energy have been making very solid profits over the last 5 years, but it's not producing rent. And so I think as a consequence, that means that government would need to send a signal to the NOC that this is what's expected of it, that it should be refocusing its portfolio, even if that involves a reduced rent. The other thing is, I think governments have to really be thinking about how to bring the NOC strategy in line or to be in sync with the national development plans and with their climate policy, or at least not to have these things working at cross purposes, which has too often been the case. So there shouldn't be in silos, and they should really be, there should be some thought to how it all comes together. The thing is also, I think, for governments to think about what impact a change in portfolio of, real refocusing on it as a national energy company, what impact this has on state-owned enterprises in the country, the state utilities, on private sector companies and domestic private players, the potential that they could be crowded out in this refocus. But I think also it needs to involve a mindset change on the part of the companies, of the NOCs and of the governments. Because as I said, the hard fact is that an NOC that faces the point of declining export markets for its oil and gas is facing reduced ability to produce rent. And so if it's not a rent producer, that has political implications in the country. It means that, especially I'm thinking in countries where NOCs are contributing a majority of the government's income. So NOCs and governments have to prepare for lower revenues. For the NOC, that means focusing on cost efficiency. For NOCs and governments, it means not borrowing against ambitious expectations of returns for the sector over long term. So to be very cautious about borrowing. And then what's interesting is to reflect a little bit about how NOCs will lose power domestically. Governments will lose the ability to tap into that easy money that is in the past has allowed them to govern sometimes with limited concerns for democratic demands. So I think these are big changes that are just starting to sort of come to the surface. But I wanted to, coming back to Patrick's introduction, really try to break this down a little bit, because I've been speaking generally, and the timeline for these changes will depend very much on a variety of factors. And so to understand, the vulnerabilities and the opportunities that NOCs face in the transition, there are some maybe simplistic ways of breaking it down. But first and foremost, of course, is high cost versus low cost. So high cost reserve holders versus low cost. And cost is a factor of the given resources that you have, but it's also very much a factor of efficiency and focus on cost control. Another differentiator is national oil companies versus national gas companies, with gas having a longer lifespan in the transition as a transition fuel, at least ultimately to the extent that gas is used domestically to meet those energy needs. It has an even longer lifespan. And then increasingly, the differentiator is high emission intensity versus low emission intensity. So, NOCs that have mostly unconventional or heavy oil that are flaring gas are in that high emission intensity group, and they will be much more vulnerable to the transition naturally, versus those that can work to reduce emissions, use gas rather than flare it, prevent methane leaks, and those kinds of emissions. So I think also, what's interesting is to see in terms of those vulnerabilities that NOCs have, some of them are fixed and some of them NOCs can work on. They can work on driving costs down, and they can work on reducing carbon intensity. And both require strong and efficient internal processes. It involves standard operating procedures, monitoring and tracking HSC metrics, operational metrics, financial metrics, and to have that real focus across the company on monitoring performance and against all these targets. And it requires like a corporate culture focused on running a tight ship, essentially. And often that is not what we find in NOCs, because it's been an industry in which there are high profits, and that meant there hasn't needed to be as much of that focus, and that is no longer the case. I think the future era really is going to require that transformation of culture, and if there isn't that change, then there's a real vulnerability for NOCs, and I'd argue the greatest vulnerability for NOCs in the transition lays there. Now, one last differentiator that I think I should raise is the one as Patrick highlighted, and just hearing, in the presenters we have today, is the difference between established producers and emerging producers. So an NOC that's in a country that is just starting in the oil and gas sector is going to have a very different carbon footprint, a very different role in the political economy of the country, and the countries that we're thinking of with emerging producers like UNOC are importing fossil fuels. They're often carbon sinks like Guyana and Suriname that are actually with their huge force that are negative emitters. And they don't have an industrial value chain that's tied to the petroleum sector. They aren't really locked into that development path yet. Does that make it easier for them to shift? I think that could be a really interesting topic for a discussion. My sense is that yes, it does make it easier to shift to more renewables and clean energy. But there is always the challenge of financial might, because these little companies don't usually have that financial might without the production revenues. So I think, in conclusion, it's a truism that NOCs are different from one another. But what's interesting is when you start to break it down and understand why. And I think my parting point is really just that it's important to see that the role of NOCs in the transition is not like that of IOCs. And so we have to separate these conversations. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Valerie, and thanks to all of our panelists. We are going to jump into the Q&A. We've been getting some great questions in the Q&A box. And so I'd ask all of the panelists who are able to please turn on your cameras. I'm going to try and steer some of the questions. And for those of you who are panelists and attendees, we're slated to have about 10 minutes left. But seeing the number of questions and seeing the heavy number of participants who are still in, I propose that for all those who are able, let's stay on for an extra 10 minutes or so, so that we can try and answer as many questions as possible. What I'd like to do, looking at the questions that we have, Juan Manuel, I think I'm going to start with you. We have two questions that are specifically for you, and I'm sure you can see them, but I'm also going to read them so that for people who are watching the video, they can hear the questions as well. So the first one is, as a listed NOC, what are the biggest pressure points for Ecopetrol's strategy shift? The financial sector and the ESG movement, or government climate commitments? And then the second is, given the commitment of Ecopetrol regarding climate change goals, why insist on fracking? Wouldn't that be far from your commitments? So over to you to answer these questions.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Two good questions. Let me take the first one, and then I will approach the fracking question too. I think the pressures come from all the areas that they have mentioned, but I will highlight, for example, the difficulties sometimes that oil and gas companies have with markets, and financial markets in particularly, specifically making the markets understand the need that oil and gas companies have to diversify. So let me give you an example. When we announced initially the transaction, the non-binding offer that we made for the transmission company, the first reaction of analysts from the financial markets was, why? We invested in you guys because you're a hydrocarbon fossil fuel company. If we wanted to go and see you guys getting into the electricity business, we would have invested in an electricity company, not directly in an oil and gas company. So that's the first kind of reaction, okay? So a lot of effort has to be made to educate them and let them know that we need to plan for a company that is sustainable, not only with a vision of 5 to 8 years, but with a long-term vision, 10, 15, 20 years. So with the markets, you have that challenge, okay? You have the specific challenge of letting them know that even though you are very efficient and you're a good business in the hydrocarbon fossil fuel sector, you can also be proficient and carry out a business in another sector different from the hydrocarbon fossil fuel, and that there are synergies between both businesses, that there are strong synergies between what we see as a complementary business. For example, this transmission business, we are bringing 15% of EBITDA from a business that is non-fossil fuel oriented, that is excluded from the volatility of oil markets, of price. So, and at the end of the day, they have started to see that aspect too, and recognize that. But that was difficult. It's also difficult with financial markets in the following area. You have the analysts that take a look on how you do it with investments in hydrocarbon, but at the same time, you have the investment community which is separate from the analysts, market analysts, requesting you with all these ESG targets, with all these specific requests from key performance indicators on how you are doing with emissions, how you do. So it's reconcile that view, those views in the market is also different. It's also difficult. You have, on the one side, analysts asking you to move your reserve lifespan. Okay, you have 7 years of reserves. We need to see 9. We need to see 10 years of reserves. But at the same time, on the other side, when you sit with other people from the same financial institution, they're asking you how you transition. So they do not communicate internally. So you have those kinds of challenges. With climate commitments, we also have challenges, going back to that question, particularly because we have made our commitments to 2030 and 2050. But if we are to reach our commitments in 2050 to be the net zero company that we want to be, we need to make investments in technologies that today are not mature enough. And I'm particularly speaking of hydrogen and carbon capture, use and storage. We see that to reach that commitment of 2050 is going to be very difficult if we do not see hydrogen progress and if we do not see carbon capture, use and storage progress. Today, those are technologies that are still commercially challenging, and in order to reduce our emissions and to shift, we need to see more progress in those costs. But we do believe that they will come. Having said that, those efforts in those two areas require definitely active policies from the public sector, policy making from the public sector. Every time we study the cases of Japan, Germany, Chile, Spain, we see that hydrogen efforts in those countries have been able to be carried out because the government has been behind through different kinds of active policies. So we still need to see those kind of policies in our region, in those sectors, if we want to be successful. Going to the second question, the fracking question. we do believe that there's a lot of misunderstanding in terms of the consequences of fracking. We currently are in a business in the US, in the Texas, in the Permian, with a partner which is Occidental, and we feel very comfortable in terms of how we produce those hydrocarbons, reducing the environmental footprint in that production. We're doing it efficiently and with an emissions control that is really closely related to the kind of business that we are in a current business. We also see the short-term hydrocarbon business, known as fracking, as a huge potential for economic growth. The value chain associated to that business is amazing. And we see it in the US and we see it in the Permian. The effects of those value chains down do not only create a lot of employment, they have a great economic impact in the communities where they are involved. So I do believe that you need to reconcile both views, not only the environmental aspect, but also with the economic aspect. And the way we're producing it in the Permian is very manageable, and we're doing it in the correct way. We would like to see those experiences in Colombia, definitely, and we will believe that it can be done in the appropriate manner, definitely.
Thank you, Juan Manuel. I'm going to come next. Greg, I'm going to steer a couple of questions to you as a way to kind of kick off any reflections. The first is, given the level of debt of many NOCs, is bankruptcy a likely scenario on the horizon for some of them? Could that be a useful framework to organize a transition? I thought this would be an interesting question for you because you're thinking about the evolution of the industry and the role that different players are playing. And then I'll also throw in there any reactions to this question. Do you see the NOC's role as that of cutting off emissions as much as they can while continuing to provide the marginal oil gas in an era of the context of the energy transition? So these are both questions around what roles NOCs are playing or how they're thinking about their own business, but also how what they're producing fits into the need to for a decline in production. So any reactions, Greg?
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to the questioners. They're great questions and which really steer us to the heart of some of the challenges and paradoxes here. I think on the first question, I think there's a parallel between how companies think about the question of diversification and how governments tend to think. Now, you sometimes hear at times of low price that some companies say, well, we can't afford that green stuff. We're just struggling to keep going, and that's something we'll deal with once times are better. And that's often happened through the cycle. At the same time, governments talk a lot more about diversification when the price is low, but forget about it when the price goes back up again. I think what characterizes this moment, though, is that the issues are for companies in the oil business are becoming existential ones, and I don't think the questions of diversification can be put off for better times because we don't know what lies ahead in the oil markets, and I think very much now is the time to act. I think that the second question, the interesting thing it raises for me, I mean, Valerie talked about the different role of NOCs compared to IOCs, and the oil market is to a large extent characterized by the interaction between these two different types of production, and it raises the question, and every player in the oil market is going to be thinking, well, can't the other people move so that I don't have to? And where this points me is to the question of equity. I think we clearly have very limited carbon budgets, and we have production growth being driven by both NOCs and IOCs. But let's think here about who carries the biggest burdens in going through a transition. As we've talked about, NOCs play an important public role in delivering energy. Often they operate in poorer countries that have less resources to go through a transition. Now, I think my view is that given the level of urgency we now have in relation to carbon budgets and climate change, I think everyone needs to take action. But I'm just going to name an elephant in the room here, which is the failure of wealthy governments of the global north to provide sufficient climate finance to enable southern governments to go through a transition on a reasonable time frame. And I think that elephant is just going to grow bigger as we proceed down this road.
Thanks very much, Greg. Peter, the next question is to you. And the question says, what plans does Uganda have regarding stranded assets, e.g. pipeline, refinery, CPF, in relation to the Paris commitments? So a little bit of context for this question. There's the prospect of UNOC or the Ugandan government potentially investing huge amounts of public money in some of this infrastructure, which raises questions about whether there are risks that some of those assets could become stranded if the world gets more and more serious on Paris. So Peter, over to you for your reactions to the question.
Thank you, Patrick, and a very good question. But I wanted to thank Greg for naming the elephant in the room. And I think it's based on that most NOCs in developing countries do not see themselves stopping to produce or engage in exploration. But turning to the question, I think our biggest concern is the assets upstream being stranded, because we believe that looking at the speed of the transition and how things are changing, we should be able to have the pipeline and the refinery operate and get the return on the investment, get the debts paid, and before we hit that point that would result into them being stranded. So our biggest concern is largely on the explorations we are doing, the fields that are under development, getting stranded at some point. And our response is really to, one, focus on use of that resource internally through refining and petrochemical industries that will support the industrialization agenda in Uganda. And for now, that's what we are focusing on. But we do believe that looking at the data and looking at the speed at which energy transition is taking, looking at the rate at which countries are meeting their commitments under the Paris Agreement, we should be able to have these assets deliver, pay their debt, and be profitable for a while. But just in case the speed picks up, we'll focus on putting our resources into the petrochems. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. So let's do one more question, and I'll come to you, Valerie. There's a question specifically directed to you in the chat. Super interesting to think about domestic energy demand and rent as main drivers. For the latter, for rent, how can we define the rules of the market in a way that efficiency improvements could be harvested financially by NOCs? How do we make efficiency gains to be more of a core part of how NOCs think about their businesses and their plans?
Thanks. So I think, it's governments need to incentivize NOCs to invest in the way that they want them, for the outcome they want. So the way they're financially structured determines whether they're focused on costs. So if they're in a system where they pay their costs get paid, and they transfer the rest to government, and they just take a little percentage, that's not going to incentivize cost focus. but a company that is structured financially like an international oil company with a royalty, tax, and dividend system is going to be incentivized to reduce costs, especially if there's a higher royalty rate, so government makes sure that it takes out a little more at the top. And I think that's just it's the eternal issue is how does government know that the NOC is being efficient in performing to a high standard? That's been an eternal question in the oversight of NOCs, and that'll continue in this transition as well. But certainly, it's really up to governments to give those signals of, efficiency is your focus now. We want some energy provision so that, we can meet our Millennium Development Goals. People need this kind of energy access in this area of the country. Do it at a cost, or without profit. This is important. Those are kind of instructions from government that have to guide NOCs, and without them, it becomes a bit of a rogue player, filling up space.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Valerie, and thank you to all of our panelists and to all of those who are here in attendance. It's really fantastic. I think at our peak we had 105 participants in the session, and it's really valuable to see all of you here. I hope that we'll continue to have similar levels of interest for the next stages of the series. I want to leave this session with 3 notes in particular. I won't try to sum up what everyone has said, in particular because the panelists come from a lot of different perspectives, and so there's not consensus on how to approach all of these issues. But there's 3 things that I want to say in closing, just as sort of things to leave everybody with as we move forward and as we continue to think about all of this. Number 1, hearkening back to a point that Greg raised, the perspectives of NOCs in this are incredibly important, and we're really grateful to have Juan Manuel and Peter able to join us. But as we think about these fundamental questions about the role that oil and gas plays in national development plans, it's not just the NOC that matters, right? These have to be strategic decisions made across government and with heavy impact, heavy influence from citizens as part of an open process, right? Fundamental decisions about what the role of oil and gas should be in the economy going forward, how the country manages and balances its climate commitments, all of our collective commitments to save the climate, with national development and economic management goals. So taking a broader perspective on what really matters and how to drive decision making, I think, is really critical. We're going to continue to try to do that over the course of the series by bringing different perspectives on board. Second, tunnel vision is deadly. Tunnel vision among NOCs and governments is deadly. Too often companies think of things from the perspective of, okay, this is how we've always done it, and we will continue to do everything we can to keep doing things in this way. Governments have tunnel vision, sometimes saying, we've depended upon oil for decades, we need to continue to depend upon oil. And particularly with the climate crisis and with the economic crisis facing a lot of oil producing countries, moving beyond tunnel vision is absolutely critical. But I think the reverse is also true, right? And those of us in the climate and resource governance communities, the climate advocacy and resource governance advocacy communities, also need to try to avoid tunnel vision on our front too, and to think about how achieving our goals of fighting climate change and promoting development depend upon the imperatives and the needs of people within producing countries as well. And so this kind of harmonization and getting out of those tunnels, I think, is really critical. And then third is just to come back to this point about diversification as a real key. And that's the question of diversification has bedeviled oil and gas producing countries for years, for decades. And it's not an easy question, but I think now more than ever, established producers need to start thinking in a more serious way about how we start to invest in the long-term future. New producers, as Valerie said, need to be thinking right from the beginning about how to avoid making investments that lock the country in to a path that may not be sustainable. NOCs play a huge role in these questions, in particular because of the huge role they play in collection and expenditure of public revenues, and thinking about how to move beyond this sort of lock-in and look for a future that is safe for the climate and also safe for the citizens of the producer countries is the key. Not an easy question, obviously, but one that we'll look forward to continuing to explore with all of you. So thank you so much to all of you for joining. We will follow up with more information on the next steps in the series, and have a fantastic day, fantastic evening, and be safe and well. Thank you.